Hello and welcome. My name is Lisa Upton. I'm the Senior Communications Advisor with the Climate Council. And this evening I'm joined by the Climate Council CEO, Amanda Mackenzie, and our Chief Climate Counsellor, Tim Flannery. I want to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to the elders both past and present. And I extend this respect to the traditional owners of the land from where you are joining us this evening. I'd like to warmly welcome you to the very first Climate Council online book club. We thought at this time it would be nice to get together every 3 weeks or so, safely of course, and spend some time discussing a book or a film related to climate change. And the first book we've selected is The Future We Choose by Christiana Figueres and Tom Rivett-Carnac. We've chosen this book because it's new, because Christiana Figueres was recently in Australia to promote it, and most importantly because it's optimistic. And if ever there was a time for optimism, it is now. I'll begin by asking Amanda and Tim a series of questions, and then we'll turn to questions from you. We'll finish up at about 6:45 in about 40 to 45 minutes. At the bottom of your window, you will see a Q&A icon. At any point during the discussion, you can click that and type your question for Amanda and Tim. Our wonderful colleagues behind the scenes, Alex and Bree, will be helping to filter those questions through to us. If you're tweeting or posting about the book, please use the hashtag Climate Council Book Club and tag us at Climate Council on Twitter and the Climate Council on Instagram. So let's begin, and let's begin by talking about the authors. As the UN Executive Secretary for Climate Change, Christiana Figueres was central to putting together the Paris Agreement, and Tom Rivett-Carnac was her senior political strategist. In December of 2015, all 195 governments of the world adopted the Paris Agreement, the most pivotal climate agreement in history. Amanda, you were there. Tell me about Christiana Figueres and how she pulled this off.
It makes me tingle, Lisa, just thinking back to that time. Tim and I were both over there for the couple of weeks of the Paris Agreement, and I remember vividly when it was finally signed, and the whole place just went insanely wild. We'd had such a disappointment a few years earlier in Copenhagen. I think what was really impressive about Christiana that she talks about in the book is that she was relentlessly positive through the whole of those years prior to it. She talks about after Copenhagen, there was this view that it's impossible to get an international agreement, but she didn't accept this view. And she just kept saying, no, we're going to get it done. And that building of momentum, you know, every time she convinced someone that it was possible, there was another person to be pushing it with their government or their institution, and gradually it was this cascade. And she brings that attitude to the book as well. And I think that we as the Climate Council try and institute that in the work that we're doing, to say, the only way that you get momentum is having that vision and then relentlessly pursuing it.
Tim, I've heard Tom Rivett-Carnac, the co-author of this book, say that Christiana Figueres' refusal to collude in the narrative of pessimism was one of the major factors that led everyone to realise this was an opportunity to grasp. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, look, Christiana is a total hero. She's one of the great heroes of mine. And I remember her, you know, way back in Copenhagen when we had such high hopes, and those hopes were dashed. And I remember her first, she talks about it in the book actually, her first press conference after the Copenhagen meeting, where she was asked, are we going to get a deal? And she said, not in my lifetime. Mm. So we were all thrown down by that. But to come back from that and be in the box seat for 6 years with using everything she had to create that deal in Paris is just awesome. You know, the team that was put together, the French diplomats, you know, the chair were just so important. But without Christiana's, what I say, gritty optimism, she calls it, we wouldn't have got there. So we owe her a huge deal.
The book starts by presenting two scenarios for our future and says we basically have the power to create either one of them. In chapter 2, the authors outline the very dangerous trajectory we're on right now, what the world would look like in 2050 if no further efforts are made to control emissions beyond the emissions reductions registered in 2015. It's so depressing that it's hard to read. Amanda, for those who haven't had a chance to read the whole book, can you outline what this world looks like?
I think everyone will have a fair degree of knowledge about the types of things that will happen. So she does talk about the types of extreme weather events that we'll see more of, the increasing ferocity, the increased frequency. So whether that's fires or whether it's consequences of sea level rise, floods, drought, heat waves, etc. But then she also takes it a step further to talk about, well, what are the implications downstream of that occurring? So what is the economic ramifications if you're having those sorts of extreme weather events over and over much more regularly? What does it mean for countries that don't have stable political systems or particularly stable economic systems? She talks about mass migration. She talks about refugee crises. She really paints the picture of what this can look like in another sort of 50 years time, but obviously it doesn't all happen in 50 years. It gradually happens, and we are seeing that. We've got the vision of what that can look like now. So a country like Syria, for instance, she talks about, that had a very bad drought for a long time. It also had a refugee crisis as a consequence of the Iraq war, and those two things together were part of the reason that the Syrian war then took place, the civil war. So there are now a number of examples around the world of the downstream consequences of the extreme weather events that are exacerbated by climate change. And some of those extreme weather events are the big ticket items, like the big bushfires we just had over summer, but some of them are more gradual, encroaching. So the desertification of areas of Sudan or things like that.
Thanks, Amanda. Tim, fortunately, after chapter 2, things look a bit better. Chapter 3 is called The World We Must Create, and then the book is really a call to action on how we create it. The chapter begins in 2050. We've been successful at halving emissions every decade since 2020. We're heading for a world that will be no more than 1.5 degrees warmer by 2100. Tell us what this world looks like according to the authors.
Well, as I read that chapter, I felt that Christiana was incredibly prophetic, because right now we are sort of experiencing some elements of that world. You know, who would have believed 2 months ago that we would cut global aviation and therefore reduce emissions enormously, that so few cars were on the road, that the oil price would drop to $20 a barrel, that there'd be no cruise ships polluting the oceans, and no non-essential maritime activity. And yet we're living through all of that right now. And, as I read that chapter about the better world we can create, I kept on coming back to the impact of the COVID virus on our society, some of which is very negative, clearly. But the positives are that we are valuing our time in a way we haven't in the past. I think has been an internal shift. We've questioned what is important to us. Is international travel or going on really that important, or are there other things that are important? And you've only got to look at the clean air in places like Delhi. I don't know whether you've seen those incredible kind of videos showing Delhi before and Delhi after, or Beijing before and Beijing after. The whole world is experiencing clean air for the first time in decades. So, that chapter was so inspiring to me, because we know we have to do it by 2050. What COVID has shown us is we can have that world now if we want. We can accelerate the clean energy revolution. We can use the money that we'll need to rebuild our economies, focus that on the clean technologies, so that we don't go back like in 2009 through a huge increase in emissions and pollution. So that chapter of that better world, I think we've got an inkling of it at the moment, and it's so achievable. And that better world is not a world without purpose. It's a world where we're building a whole new clean economy, where we're revaluing our relationships to each other and to the planet. It's a hugely exciting world to me, and a hugely optimistic world. So I found that, to me, that was the highlight of the book. Reading that chapter, just thinking, wow, we can do this.
So for me, the highlight of the book, or one of the things I found most interesting, is how much it focuses on our mindsets, arguing that faced with an urgent task, it may feel counterintuitive to first look inside ourselves, but it's essential. Amanda, do you agree with this? And if so, why?
Yeah, I found that really interesting as well, that she identified that so clearly. And she used the word throughout the book of being intentional. She said we must be highly intentional, essentially about cultivating ourselves, within ourselves, those attitudes that can serve us and then serve the world. So she talks about that in reference to a number of different things. The stubborn optimism that Tim was talking about. She says, you know, we are faced with this relentless bad news, pessimism from others, our own self-doubt, etc. But our job is to maintain a stubborn optimism that enables us to keep pushing forward and holding that vision of a better future. And it's not about ignoring the bad news, but it's saying, well, my focus is here on what's required, and I'm focused on that vision I want to create. So here are the steps that I'm going to take to get there. And she's clear about helping you identify, well, what are the negative or problematic narratives or ideologies that exist that are deeply ingrained, and how do we work out how to move past those. And a number of, I think that reference to COVID is important too, because things that are perceived as being immovable or impossible to change, we now see that things can change relatively quickly. And obviously we would never want this sort of catastrophe, but we can do things, and do things at a very large scale. Like you think about this shift to childcare in Australia, for instance, it's suddenly free. Like these things that certain people have been advocating for years are now sort of on the table. She put it really well. She talks about the exploitative ethos of the time, that this is her quote: "The economy is based on the belief that we can extract resources boundlessly, use them inefficiently, and discard them wantonly, drawing from the planet more than it can regenerate and polluting more than we can clean up." I thought it was really well said in terms of what the current ethos has been, but it's not been identified as that. So an extractive view. And then she talks about the need to move to a self-sustaining system where humans are contributing to life sustaining itself on the earth. And I thought that was a good way of putting it. And just that the optimism that we cultivate in ourselves is critical, both to us being active, but then also how we reach out to others, we change others, and the ripple effect that has.
I just want to ask you a bit more about... Sorry, Tim, you go ahead.
Sorry, Lisa, I just thought I'd add something in there that I found really interesting in the book, which was, you know, Christiana has been in the middle of the international negotiations now for many years. And she realised that they were all premised on this idea that I win, you lose. You know, if I gain something, others lose. And that was sort of true when clean energy was more expensive than fossil fuels, because if you wanted to move forward, you had to pay that privilege in a way. And only a few countries like Germany were really willing to do that at scale. But she makes the point that that has totally changed now. That the price of clean energy has dropped so low that now it's a win-win situation. I clean up, the whole world wins, and I win because I've got cheaper energy, cleaner energy, better energy. And I'll be very interested to see how the next COP meeting plans out, because every COP meeting, which Council of Parties meeting on climate change that Christiana's been part of, they've all founded on the same issues. This issue of the developed nations are really responsible because they're the ones who put most of the pollution up, therefore they should clean it up. We can now move beyond that, as Christiana says, and put the point of view that actually we'll all win from cleaning up because this is now cheaper. And that is so inspiring. And I'll be very interested to see how the negotiators, businesses and governments, once this is realised, start acting.
I've just noticed that there is a question that refers to COP26 from an audience member. So Christiana Figueres was instrumental, as we know, in the Paris Agreement. This person says, I loved reading about her stubborn optimism in making sure something actually came out of those talks. COP26 has now been postponed due to coronavirus. What sort of impact will this have on the global momentum for climate action? And how do we channel stubborn optimism and believe that global change can occur when the biggest hope we had for global action this year has been pushed back? Who'd like to take that one?
I can jump in on that first. I think it's a good thing that it's been pushed back. I think that it's a event that could have been sidetracked by all of this uncertainty and and focus. I think we need to move it to a time where there can be more of a focus. It's also not an event, I think, that would be fruitful to do online. I think when you've got so many different cultures and languages and all those things, you really need people to be in the same room, and you need to have what Christiana had, that those personal interactions where she was pushing for change. I think that was actually a critical factor. So I'm not as worried about it being moved back. I think countries are still, they still have their targets, they're still acting. And this meeting is really important because it's another marker in the process of submitting targets. So it's really important. So I think it's okay that it's moved back. I think it's not the only process of momentum building. I think that the big piece now is how do we recover from coronavirus, and how do we infuse that recovery with climate solutions. So they must be hand in glove. We have to be solving these two massive crises together. And that's obviously not just Australia, it's every country around the world. And as Tim said, many of the solutions can be win-win.
Sorry, Tim, do you want to say something there?
Yeah, sorry, I'll just add in a tiny bit there. I think it's important for us all to understand that the outcome of COP26 is being predetermined pretty much right now as the nations of the world look at the impacts of the COVID pandemic and what they will need to do to stimulate their economy in the future. And that will actually determine in some ways what happens. So if there's enough political pressure brought to bear that governments have to take a science-based approach to solving climate, just as they have now to solve COVID, and we demand that recovery brings about a reduction in emissions, then we'll be in good shape for a great outcome at COP26, even if it's held a little bit late. If we waste this opportunity, we'll see emissions grow at the end of the pandemic, and much good work will be forfeited, will be undone. So I just think it's important for the people listening now to know that this is the moment. Write to your politician, write to your representative saying, we know you're thinking about recovery, whatever. Can you give us a guarantee that you will be focusing on clean energy, cleaner air, better outcomes, cheaper outcomes for us all at the end of this, instead of propping up the old fossil fuel industry?
I want to pull you both back a little bit to this idea of stubborn optimism, because it's the extract that we shared with our audience. And Amanda, you raised it before, but a lot of this book is very personal, and as we've discussed, talking about changing your own mindset. The authors write that optimism is not soft, it is gritty. Every day brings dark news, and no end of people tell us that the world is going to hell. To take the low road is to succumb. To take the high road is to remain constant in the face of uncertainty. That we may see worsening climate conditions in the short term should not surprise us. We have to elect to boldly persevere. Amanda, are you stubbornly optimistic about the future? And if so, what makes you optimistic?
I'm definitely stubbornly optimistic. I don't think you can work constantly on this issue without making that a core part of your personality. And there's been many times that have been really devastating working on the issue. Tim mentioned Copenhagen. A more recent one is when Tim and I were diving on the Great Barrier Reef in the 2016-17 bleaching, seeing those forests of coral that had just turned white, and you see the fish and sharks and turtles that are still there cruising over it, knowing that those areas will die, and probably there will be no food for those animals in that immediate vicinity. So, you know, I think we all have felt those moments of real grief working on this issue or engaging with the issue. But I think I just have this relentless faith in humanity to solve problems. I think that, you know, we've already come a long way. I remember Tim saying to me a few years ago, we just have to keep looking back to see how far we've come. And I really do that a lot. Think about, you know, where were we a few years ago, and even the start of the Climate Council 6.5 years ago. At that time, our first report was one on bushfires, where we said bushfires and climate was linked. And Tony Abbott said, you know, that's bullshit. And there was so much pushback. There was this relentless pushback on what we were saying. Whereas now, over the last bushfire season, it was very clear to everyone, all the major commentators that were talking about it had to talk about climate change, and even the more conservative parts of the coalition had to admit at various points that climate change was exacerbating these extreme weather events. So that's just a small example of how far we've come, let alone some of the technological change and economic change. So I think having those moments to look back helps you to stay optimistic. And then Christiana and Tom talk about this cultivating a vision of the future. And I think I've got a small daughter, she's only 2, and I think you can't be anything other than relentless and stubbornly optimistic in that sort of looking at her. You think, well, this is my responsibility. And I like that they use that word a lot, that they talk about this is what a privilege we have to exist at this time in human history, that we actually live at a time of consequence when you can make a difference. And particularly if you live in a developed, wealthy country like Australia, like what a great privilege we have, but also great responsibility to be doing something.
And what about you, Tim? How do you maintain a sense of optimism when you've worked on this issue for decades and you're faced with setback after setback? I know, Amanda, you look back on things that have been achieved, and there's been so many of them, but there have been serious setbacks too.
Look, I think to be truthful with you, you can't always maintain that optimism. You know, after Copenhagen, I felt like I'd been just king hit. You know, it was several months before I could think straight, really, and work out what to do. I still remember just the difficulty of getting motivated about anything. But, you know, you've got to have one other thing in addition to that optimism. And I think mostly I'm stubbornly optimistic. But Amanda has that in spades, and that is ingenuity. And I still remember when we were sacked by the government, the Abbott government, as the Climate Commission, Amanda came up to me and said, well, why should we accept that? And it had never occurred to me for a moment we didn't have to accept being sacked and we could do something else. So it's that thinking laterally, that ingenuity that's really needed, that keeps us all going, I think. And so I don't want to piss in your pocket, Amanda, but I just think we're so lucky to have you as CEO because you constantly show that incredible
thanks, Tim.
Keeps the council going.
Tim, the book also quotes or talks about Nelson Mandela on forgiveness and says it's a big part of succeeding. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, look, I found that personally the most difficult bit of the book. When I look at people like, you know, the denialist politicians, Barnaby Joyce, you know, Angus Taylor, Kelly and Craig Kelly, and think we have to forgive them while they're still damaging us. Can we do that? You know, and you look at ExxonMobil, who knew in 1982 exactly what was happening. They had their climate projections. They knew where we'd be in 2020 if they were successful in avoiding any reductions in emissions. And yet they still went ahead and did it. She quotes Nelson Mandela. You know, he was in jail for 27 years. He was told 24 hours before he was released, he was going to be released by de Klerk. And he knew that if he walked out of that jail door without having forgiven the apartheid regime, he would never forgive them. And he did it somehow. I'm still struggling with that, I must say. I find it really, really hard. But I can see the necessity of it. We have to focus on the future. We can't just be focused on the past and worried about retribution and so forth. We don't have the time or energy to do that. And besides it somehow limits your generosity as a person. We need to be greater than those who are destroying or trying to destroy our world. But I still find it an enormous challenge.
Amanda, did those references to Nelson Mandela and Mahatma Gandhi that are really littered throughout the book, did they resonate with you?
Oh, they've got some beautiful examples through the book of people who were stubborn optimists. Like, you can't get more optimistic than Mandela being in prison for 27 years, and she mentioned Gandhi and Martin Luther King. I think what I would have liked to see in the book is a little bit more of people who weren't just the most famous icons of change. I think that often we can tell a story about those big moments in social change that come down to just one person, when of course there were millions of people that were involved in each of those examples of social change. And, you know, there were icons, but there were lots of other people that did really important things. And sometimes in those stories, we tell a story so often it almost seems like there was just one figurehead when there was lots of people involved. And I think for all of us, you know, there's always got to be roles for many people, and they do talk about in the book. The thesis is everyone plays a role everywhere, and your job is to get the right attitude, cultivate it within yourself, cultivate it within your friends, and then do stuff in your environment where you can. Essentially, that's what they're arguing, and all of that stuff is really important and will add up to the whole. So I think they could have included a few more examples of that at lots of different scales.
I want to turn to some of our questions from the audience. We have one from Robert who says, the government is relying heavily on experts to navigate the present dilemma. And so do you feel there is any chance they will turn to the experts regarding the climate crisis?
Maybe could I jump in there a bit?
Yes.
Look, I think the climate crisis and the COVID pandemic share some really striking similarities. You know, both the greenhouse gases and the virus that is infecting people are carried through the air, this great aerial ocean of ours. You know, they're both invisible. They both travel almost instantly around the planet, or have the capacity to do that. And they both need to be tackled before the problems become really evident. They need to be tackled at an early stage if they're to be controlled. And they can only be tackled through using expert advice and opinion. So the only difference is that the climate problem is rather slower than the COVID pandemic. It's just a time-related thing. But I think that once people realise that you need good scientific advice and you need a phased approach to deal with a problem like that, they will demand it of governments in terms of the climate crisis. And you know, even the phases of the COVID pandemic tend, in my mind, to line up with the climate problem. I mean, there's the initial problem of containment for the COVID pandemic. That's very much like the problem of reducing emissions, you know, for us. So we have to contain the problem. The next step is making sure you've got enough emergency capacity. And that's really all about adaptation and other means we might use to limit the damage that the greenhouse gases, existing greenhouse gases, have already caused. And, you know, the final phase, the solution really is developing a vaccine. Well, in climate terms, it's all about drawdown, getting some of the gas out of the air. This is a medium-term objective that takes a lot of research and development. So I can see how the COVID pandemic will be enormously instructive. And I do think that people will demand more from government now that they've seen a government that they finally respect, that listens to the experts, that's willing to do the hard things, that's willing to bring people along with it. And we know we can do it. I mean, the COVID pandemic has shown that we can do it. So I'm quite optimistic that 2020 is a real turning point for the planet, and that we will start to see Christiana Figueres' version of the good world materialise much sooner than any of us have hitherto thought possible.
We've all been infected by her stubborn optimism. Amanda, there's a question from Karen. I love the chapter on consumerism and the idea of bringing about change with your spending. How can we leverage this to make it more powerful? Who can we trust to provide reliable information on sustainable practices?
It's a big question. I think in the book, they don't go into a lot of detail about how to shift from that consumerism philosophy. I think they they get into some detail about not only the kind of attitude change, but the philosophical change or ideological change that's required in our society. They don't call for a whole-scale systemic change to our systems. They basically say we've got our systems, but we need to tweak them in a number of ways, and changing the way we see value in the economy is key. So not measuring it by GDP, using things like the Sustainable Development Goals as guides for how you might develop that. I think that on what can you trust in terms of information, in terms of sustainability, there's a number of different sort of websites on different consumables. So there's websites around like fish, for instance, the more sustainable fish, or there's ones that are the sort of the fast fashion websites versus the ones that are using more organic and sustainable products. I think that at the end of the day, it's the more natural the product, probably the more sustainable it is. And they ask in the book, the big challenge is to say to yourself, is this something that is planet restoring, or is this decision something that is taking from the planet? I think that it's, in a way, that question's too simplistic, because almost everything makes it, your decision making in everyday life will become very difficult if you were doing that, because so many things are just the systems that we're a part of make life hard to make the decisions that are relevant for the planet. I think this is where I take a bit of issue with some of the book, is that there's a lot on personal action that you can take in your own life to reduce emissions. They argue that everyone should have a plan to reduce their emissions by 60%. And my view is that that personal action that we can all take, while important, shouldn't take up the time that we would be using for political activism, or to be changing things that we do together. So our schools or our communities or our businesses, because you can spend a lot of time trying to get change within your own household, but it might not add up to a lot if others aren't doing it too. So where you can do that in concert, it's really valuable. But if you're just as a lone ranger, it makes it really hard. So even if it's as a street, it's much more valuable, obviously, than just doing it on your own. So I think in the book, they could have done more to prioritize which of the activities on your own, which of the activities you should be doing. So personal action for me is probably lower on the list than that political action or the financial action where you're investing.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. There's one from Catherine and David. Tim, maybe this is one for you. Scott Morrison wants Australia to snap back after the pandemic. How do we convince him and Angus Taylor to snap forward towards the next COP?
Well, that's the great question, isn't it? And those attitudes in government are being formed right now. So there's never been a better time to get politically active than right now with this. I think that it's going to be very difficult for government to control, if you want, societal attitudes on this, or to influence them as they have before, because people have had a taste now of what is possible. And I think can you imagine if Parliament opens again and we get, Scott Morrison there holding a lump of coal again, or Angus Taylor arguing that, coal is the future? How is that going to play, given they've just been relying on experts to deal with a very, very difficult problem? The fossil fuel industry would love it. I had a look at the Minerals Council Journal for March, and the front page is King Coal and how they're going to come back bigger and better with the help of the federal government. So that's one narrative that the industry's got, but we need to beat that. We really need to start influencing them right now, and letting people know that we expect them, if they want to continue to hold our respect, they need to start acting on the other problems that we have in society in the same way they've done with COVID.
Lisa, can I jump in on that one?
Of course.
I think I have a somewhat different view to Tim. I have less faith that the experience of relying on experts will rub off. I think that health is an easier thing because there has not been the culture war. This sort of disease emerged, and there's then the emergent response. I think there's been this long-term tribalism in our politics, between different sides of politics as to where they stand. And as long as climate change is continued to be viewed as a greenie issue or an environment issue, you see this enormous resistance. There's also the revolving door of Parliament and the lobbying efforts of the fossil fuel industry, which has tainted our politics. So my sense is, I go back to the sort of what they've written in the book about the blame. In a way, like Tim said, I think it is important that the blame's less relevant than the outcome. So what we want is to get to a point where everyone across the political spectrum is on board with taking action. And I think that economics will be king in making this happen. So now the economic case has to be paramount, because our economy will be in such dire straits as a consequence of this disease. So everything will have to go through the lens of, is it economically, does it make sense? So something like a new coal-fired generator, 100% won't make sense now, in a way that maybe you could have got it around people before because of an ideological bent. So that gives me some hope that the economists will be the experts that will be listened to in this environment, provided we can make sure that they have the right information, and that the reduced cost of renewable energy, the advantages of energy efficiency technology to reduce cost, all of that will add up to things that make the solutions to climate change also solutions to an economic crisis. So I think what we need to do, as I said earlier, is make sure that the way that we couch these issues is, it's not just about the environment. This is about building an economy for the future and building that the world that is resilient to multiple different challenges.
You both touched on this briefly, but I'm going to share a question from Andy, because you made a point or two. He asks, how can clean energy, tech and transport play a part in our recovery from the current crisis?
Sorry, I think I got that. Was that has clean energy, tech and transport? Was that right?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, I think that Amanda, she just made the case that economics is going to be important with this. And what we know is that 42% of coal-fired power plants globally are loss-making at the moment. That the cheapest energy options almost everywhere are wind and solar, and that includes Australia, for new energy build, and soon will be competitive with even old coal. So in terms of clean energy, there's just it's an open and shut case. We should be going towards 100% clean energy by 2030, and there's absolutely no reason we couldn't achieve that. It makes economic sense to do it. The tech stuff, I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff with tech that includes, all of the intelligence related stuff, as well as some of the industrial energy things and a whole lot of other innovations. I'm not quite sure how they're going to play out, but there's some very promising options there. Probably not so much for the next few years, but beyond that, that'll be very important. For transport, we are poised on the edge of a huge revolution. And if government policy is set in a way that will encourage the uptake of electric vehicles and buses and so forth, we will save very valuable years in terms of emissions and dealing with this problem early. So I just feel we're just at the edge. We're teetering on the edge. COVID virus might have eroded some of the resistance. I don't know, Amanda. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's going to be harder than I think. But that shows you
stubbornly optimistic, Tim.
I know, but I do think that we see how we can do it now. We know that it can be done. So yes, I think all of those things are going to have a huge role, and it would be great to see government that has very deliberative policy about encouraging that transition. There's no way. What is the argument for opposing it now, Amanda? What is the argument? What's the tribalist argument?
Yeah, it's going to be very hard to make that argument in this economic climate, I think, except that the fossil fuel lobby is already going gangbusters trying to get things through. But it's interesting, even it looks like the share price of gas has diminished pretty significantly recently too. So I think getting the capital to do a range of those projects will be very hard in this environment. But I think the other thing is to think about our economy as this is not just, this probably won't be just a normal recession. This is going to be very significant. And what are the sorts of large scale projects that are required? Dan Andrews in Victoria has been talking about infrastructure as key. Surely that will be the case in other states as well. So there's been a number of proposals now around not just going to 100% renewable energy, but more like 500 or 700%, and setting up new manufacturing industries that are based on clean energy, to build new fuels like hydrogen fuels that are reliant on renewable energy. So these are great new options for Australia. And again, I think the mindset needs to be, this is about how we now set up a 21st century economy. We've had this huge shock, which is obviously we're still at just the beginning of. Now, how do we move forward and create something better than what was there before? So that sort of build back better story that we often talk about after bushfires and other extreme weather events, we should bring to this as well.
There's an important question that's come from V that's related to this conversation, and she asks, how do we move the workforce from the resource industry and into other industries that are more environmentally friendly? Most of the workers in the industry are fearful of losing jobs and a way of life. So how do we take these people forward, reassuring them that there is a future for them? Tim, would you like to have a go at that?
Sure. Look, it's a question that is not just occupying minds in Australia, but occupying minds globally. And some of the best innovative thinking I've seen in this area comes out of Germany, which has had a high dependence upon coal mining for a long, long time. And they're now committed to leaving coal mining without losing a single job in the coal sector. So they've developed a plan called the Coal Compromise, which involves payouts to coal companies and to coal communities. It also involves the development of innovative new industries in those coal fields, such as pumped hydro using old mines. It also relies on a lot of mine site remediation as well, so to pay people to fix up old mine sites. And the cost of it is manageable within the scale of the German economy. And it's a cost which is really well worth paying. You know, whenever I travel into rural Australia, whether it's a Hunter Valley or Gladstone or whatever, you hear people say, without coal, we've got nothing. And while they believe that, we won't be able to move forward. But we can, if we have a government policy that says, we will take care of you through this. We'll make sure we either reskill you for other kinds of mining or other kinds of energy development, or do something like this coal compromise, elements of it. I think we'll be fine. I think we can move forward. And take everyone along with us, make sure there's no disadvantage.
And it is about having a very inclusive story. We put out some information last year about the types of minerals that would be required in building more renewable energy, things like lithium, silver, lead, other things. And obviously it needs to be mined in a way that's conscious of health impacts and all those sorts of things. But what we found is that the towns that ran that story, we found Mount Isa, for instance, ran a front page story about the green revolution will be led by Mount Isa. And that's exactly the sort of article that we need, because it's saying to those communities, you're not the enemy, you're critical to this change. You know, if you're in a mining community, there's a big role for Australian mining in this revolution globally, not just in Australia. And you need to be a part of it, absolutely. It's just that you can't be mining coal. And so I think that's an important part of the story.
I can't believe that 45 minutes has just disappeared. I'm going to ask you both just for one final comment. I'm sorry to the people whose questions we didn't get to. There are a lot of them coming in, but maybe Tim, you, and then Amanda, just a final thought before we wrap up.
Sure. Look, we are living through historic times. These are times that you experience once in a lifetime. They represent a great threat, but they also represent a tremendous opportunity. I'll just say to our people listening, don't waste it. Use your influence to be heard by the people who represent you. Demand that better future, that cleaner future. Demand a future that's guided by proper scientific thinking. And tell the politicians they'll actually get some respect if they do that. I hope we can move forward.
Amanda?
I think that while we're all in isolation, it's an important time to reflect on where we can find our influence. So I think it's useful to think through, well, where can I have the biggest bang for my buck in my life? It could be how I contribute to organisations, either with time or with donations. It could be how you invest your financial resources. So thinking about where your super fund puts their money, and it could be about how you become active. And I think what the book really illustrates very clearly is it's not just about doing what we can, it's about doing everything necessary. So my, I suppose, advocacy to you would be find ways that you can get emissions down with groups in your community. So whether that's at the local school, whether that's in the business that you work in, etc. And then also think about how you can use your voice, again, with others to reach politicians and other decision makers.
Thanks, Amanda, and thanks, Tim, and thanks to you, our audience, for joining this conversation. Our next book club will be held on May the 6th. We'll be examining this book. It's called On Hope by Daisy Jeffrey. Daisy is a Year 12 student from Sydney who's been a key organiser of the student climate strikes. She'll join us along with climate counsellor Professor Leslie Hughes. We'll send out more information ahead of time. Thanks again for joining us. Stay safe and have a good evening.